Everyone, thank you so much for joining the Pacific Council on International Policy's webcast, Truth, Journalism, and Disinformation in the Age of Social Media, featuring journalist Jessica Yellin. I'm Justin Chapman, Communications Officer at the Pacific Council. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to go over a few logistical details. As a note for our audience, you will be muted and your video will be turned off for the duration of the call, but we encourage your participation, so please click on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to send in questions. We'll be conducting audience Q&A towards the latter end of the conversation, but you're welcome to submit your questions at any point during the discussion. Now to the topic at hand. The rise of social media has provided an environment conducive to the viral dissemination of disinformation. As disinformation has spread, trust in the political process, public institutions, and the press has fallen. Societies, in turn, have begun to suffer as the opinions of their publics are manipulated by bots, big data, trolling, deepfakes, and more. Tonight, we'll address how journalists can battle disinformation and report the news in an atmosphere of mistrust. Our speaker, Jessica Yellin, is an Emmy and Gracie Award-winning television journalist who has covered the White House and Capitol Hill and reported from around the globe. A native of Los Angeles and a graduate of Harvard University, Jessica has provided illuminating insight into the nature of political power and the reality of Washington policymaking, and she has interviewed all of the living US presidents. She previously served as chief White House correspondent for CNN and as a political journalist for ABC News and MSNBC. Her work has been published in the New York Times, the Daily Beast, the LA Times, the Atlantic, and many others. Jessica is also the founder of News Not Noise, a fresh voice in media that provides daily news reports on Instagram. Through that platform, she has interviewed influencers and movers and shakers from Jennifer Garner to Dr. Anthony Fauci. You can find the account at Jessica Yellin. Her first novel, Savage News, about reporting while female, is available now from HarperCollins. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Hi, thanks for having me and for that great intro.
So why don't you start by telling us about your book, Savage News, and then I'll have a few questions for you, and then we can open it up to questions from our members. So
Right.
Give us the rundown on Savage News and how much of it is based on things that really happen to female reporters.
Well, it's a novel about a young female journalist working at a cable news channel. Imagine that. It has sex, scandal, infighting, and it's not a White House tell-all, believe it or not. Although these days it could be one, right? The book is really a story of what it's like to be a young, driven reporter working inside the crazy circus of television news in Washington in this kind of moment. And it was a vehicle for me to kind of open up the experience and let people in to see kind of what it's really like when you're making the sausage. Because people would always ask me, what's it like to work at the White House or cover the White House? What's it like to be on demand, on schedule? And always the things they ask aren't the things that drive you nuts every day. And I wanted to give people like a glimpse into both the pressures and challenges and also the unique challenges of doing it all as a woman.
Mm-hmm. Did you find it challenging as a female reporter to get access to foreign sources and countries that are overtly hostile to women? And how did that compare to the treatment you experienced at the White House?
I love this question because there's always this assumption that, well, other countries are super sexist, and so it's going to be very hard to get, deal with the sexism that you find overseas. But of course, that doesn't happen here. So the reality of the situation is that I didn't find it that challenging to get access to sources overseas because in general, when you're working at an organization like CNN or ABC News, they're just excited to have access to Western media, and you're not somehow you're outside the constraints of how they might treat domestic journalists, I imagine, but they're happy to share. It was always a challenge. It was most evidently a challenge inside my own universe. And there were times when you'd have access, but what you get would be a little different. And there was a period of time when, I won't be specific, we're on the record, it's going up, but there were certain officials in certain White Houses where, the relationships would be based on whether you can talk brackets, NCAA brackets with the advisor, or do you actually play hoops, or shoot hoops? I don't even, do you say play hoops? So I'm good at a lot of things, but that's not what I'm good at. And you would lose out because it's about developing a rapport or relationship.
Sure.
And the fact that I wasn't doing those things kept me on the outs. And at one point, it impacted enough women that a bunch of women officials inside one of the administrations said, we know it's hard for you guys. Come to us. We'll hook you up. And, or let's talk about what's going on. There were other kinds of pressures in the newsroom as a woman on camera to always have hair that looked perfect, which meant stick straight without a curl. In our current world, that's an even more meaningful thing because people are really now sensitive to what that means for women of color and Black women in particular. And all sorts of different expectations for women that we all think we're beyond, but we're not entirely beyond it.
Right. Has public trust in the media been irreparably damaged, or are you optimistic that that trust can be built back up again?
Wow, that's a big question. I think that there's a couple pieces to the erosion of public trust. One, just to be blunt and put is the president calling it fake news, what the media does fake news. The other is what happened with Facebook in the last election. And then the third is just the natural evolution of our media that has grown from local newspapers where you knew your newspaper person and you trusted them and that gave that paper credibility, to more distant control where there are distant papers that you get, to television and then the internet and then this proliferation of news sources. So the fact that we've accelerated to this point where so many people get their news from sources that already share their point of view and sometimes aren't credible at all, that is a problem that's not going away, and we have to figure out how to engage to shift. The problem of Facebook is something, and we can get into that in more detail, but what they've done with politics and news is something that can be regulated. The mistrust that the public has in the media as a result of the president calling us fake news, I think to some extent that can be remedied when there's a president in that role, Democrat or Republican, who does not do that thing. The one last thing I'll say about this is it became my belief covering Washington that attacks only stick and work when they're based on something that's true. And the president's attack on fake news only works not because the news is fake, but because there's something the public is unhappy with in the media. They sense that, and he's giving them a way to make sense of it. That's not right. What we do every day is try to get the truth and do the best we can. But there are challenges in how we're telling the news that need to change so the public feels more comfortable with us every day.
Absolutely. We seem to be in this constant hyperactive news cycle, which frankly, even coming from a news junkie and fellow journalist, it's exhausting. It also seems to be driving further entrenched partisanship. Is that because people can just stay in their self-reinforcing media bubbles, or is the news being presented in a different way now? Or are we moving away from objectivity in journalism?
I always take issue with this whole concept that we used to have objectivity and we've now moved away from it. I will point out that the Pulitzer Prize comes from Joseph Pulitzer, who ran a muckraking newspaper, not a website, newspaper that had a very strong point of view. And that prior to the 50s, our news outlets had a strong point of view. In England, they do. And I mean, I think that the British are quite well informed in, general. So it's not that you have to have this, I believe, a false objectivity. I think that maybe we need to get comfortable with points of view in our news, but being more transparent about what they are. So that if somebody's quoting the X and such, that's coming from a conservative view and this is from a liberal view. So that's where I hope things are headed. On the accelerated news cycle, I'll just tell you a little story. Like when I was first out of school, I worked in the Clinton White House, and we barely had email. And that White House used to talk very freely with the press because the news cycle moved at a different pace. Things were like at a pre-email pace, and we could have a talk now, and you could decide if you're the official, I need to change what I told you, it's moved, and you can update me 3 hours later. My piece probably won't be on until the next day. There was a CNN at the time. Then I covered the Bush White House. By then there were 3 cable news channels, and we had Twitter, what did we have? We had rapid email then, and 3 cable news channels. And they knew that if they told me something, it could get on air pretty quickly, so they were more cautious. By the time I covered the Obama White House, I could be tweeting something out as they're telling me, and it could be up on any number of TV, website, blog things as they're talking. And so that led them to be more cautious, but it sped up the news cycle. You get little bits of less substantive information that we report, like bird food, like little bit. That's all the time. And so it's just this noise machine coming at you from all these sides. I don't know how we stop that, except if you and I as viewers and as programmers make choices to do things differently.
Mm-hmm. You know, lots of even informed people are confused these days about what's true or not, what's a reliable source or not. You know, it can be genuinely overwhelming. How can people find credible sources? How do they know what to do?
I always want to I wish there were a formula you could plug it in and say, I started this thing on Instagram, News Not Noise, which is under my name, @JessicaYellin, please follow. Because I knew there was this audience of people who don't know what's a credible news source and what to believe in. They're overwhelmed by all that noise coming at them, all the minutia and silliness that fills the news, and you can't get through it to what matters. We can talk about that later, but I've really struggled with, for people who don't have any point of view on the news, how do you explain what's credible? It's hard. What I generally tell an audience is, you know, the mainstream news sources are filled with reporters who wake up every day who are smart and trying to do their best. And they work inside organizations that sometimes prioritize the flashy headline or the shallow story over the substantive. But if you find a reporter you like and trust, follow them on social media, follow the people they repost, because they're reposting people who have their same journalistic values. And that is a great wormhole to go down. When you really respect someone, find who they're following. Mm-hmm. But my news diet is what, like most people's is, I'm sure, on this call: Axios, Politico. I read Tegan Goddard has the absolute best aggregation in the Political Wire. It's called $5 a month, best political aggregation out there. The Cable, I read SCOTUS blog for Supreme Court coverage, and then survey all the majors all day long, every day.
Yeah. Going back to social media, are those companies doing enough to combat disinformation, especially from politicians, political candidates on their platforms? You know, we see Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg refusing to vet or ban lies and political ads, and we also see Twitter adding, you know, essentially warning labels to some of Trump's recent tweets. Where do you think that the line should be for these companies?
First, huge kudos to Twitter for being the first to mark the president's untruthful tweets as untruthful. I think it came really late, but it shifted sentiment, and it created the oxygen for Facebook that made it so much pressure. Facebook had to do the same, or their version of the same. I have a soft spot for Instagram because I found an audience there, and it's been a platform that is inviting for what I do. I picked it because it had no real news voice there at the time I joined. Having said that, God, no, they haven't. Have they done enough? They haven't even begun to do. Like, we're in trouble. It's a crisis. It's like, you know, we're in DEFCON. They need to act. And it's evident they're not going to self-regulate. The fact that, you know, politicians can post lies and attribute it, you know, own it, and Facebook will post it. Now they'll post it with a disclaimer. I mean, they will literally promote your lie, and they'll just say, as a disclaimer, this might not be true. Here's some more information. It's not okay. I think they need to be regulated the way media companies are, in a modern sense. And I think that the fact they've been so slow to change means that they will end up regulated, because they've enraged Democrats and Republicans.
Right, it'll catch up with them eventually. So tell us more about News Not Noise. So what compelled you to start this outlet, and a little more on why you chose Instagram in particular as the platform, and how it differs from your experience at CNN?
Great question. So that's what I call it. I call it #News Not Noise, but it's under my name, Jessica Yellin. And what my whole thing was, I got into the news because I wanted to help people understand what's going on. I sound super corny when I say this, but there's a reason the free press is the only private business explicitly protected in the US Constitution. And it's because it's the duty of the press to inform citizens in a democracy so they can make an informed vote. And I, as a political reporter, would spend all my time chasing swing voters. You know, when I was at these networks, at the end of an election, swing voters are the ones who will decide it. So they're the only thing we focus on, really. And I found that overwhelmingly they were women. And there was this conventional wisdom in Washington that they can't make up their minds about who to vote for because they don't care about politics. They're disengaged. And they're up for grabs by both parties, but basically they're silly. Why wouldn't these women know? And I was out there talking to them every day, and it's not that they didn't care. They cared deeply. They didn't grok the way we're talking to them. We would shout about you know, Pelosi said this, or Boehner said that, or this Romney, Obama, slander fest, whatever. They want to know, is my healthcare going to go up? What's that policy? Who will behave in a way that I can raise kids to admire? It's a different approach. And I would go home and pitch doing things that way. And everyone's like, oh, no. That's not, no. Just stop. Don't be difficult. Do the assignment. So for a lot of reasons I left. And I just had this intuition that there's an audience that wants news told differently. And so I decided I'm going to try to do it. I pitched this all over Hollywood and I was told, oh God, no. In the future, news will only come from comedians. Wow. Or in the future, there will be no news. So I was just like, my friends were like, just do it, start. And I had to pick where. Instagram skews female. And it's a friendlier environment. It's not as like snarky as Twitter, and it didn't have the toxic hangover of news, you know, toxicity that Facebook had. So I tried it there. And then it grew, and it turns out I have an audience that's largely female, but dudes like it too.
And I imagine they're more responsive, or there's a more direct relationship than reporting the news on TV.
Yeah, the difference is on TV, I could be on the White House lawn surrounded by like, you know, 3 people, a producer, a cameraman, a sound guy, and everything's taken care of. And you talk to millions of people and you have no idea if they got it. Like, it's like the camera goes off and it's just done. Here, I post something and I immediately get feedback. I don't know what that word meant. I don't agree with you. Would you tell me this? How about, you know, here's an article, here's a video. And you get this like immediate engagement that's really interesting, and it helps you figure out where to go with your stories and how to do the news. And, you know, I have an audience that like spans Caltech professors to people who don't know how to Google a headline. And I have to teach both, you know, be a source for both. And I really like that engagement and dynamic.
Do you find it, I mean, that sounds like a lot of work. Do you find it exhausting, or do you find it invigorating? What's your experience with it?
It really depends on the day. I mean, lately it's been very intense, you know, at the minute, you know, there's just been one news cycle after another, and I'm not a newsroom. I'm me and a researcher and an editor, and like a universe of people who are supportive and helpful. But so it gets tired, it gets exhausting, but it's also hugely invigorating because I feel like there's an opportunity ahead of the election to really inform people, get people who aren't always engaged, and then after the election, keep them engaged so they participate consistently.
It's kind of an all hands on deck kind of moment.
I mean, truly, that's how I think of it. Like, what can I contribute to make a difference right now? What am I good at doing? How can I help move the needle?
Great. So we have a member question that came in. So just a reminder to our members, you can click the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen and type in a question for us. So this question comes from Jennifer Stanley. With 24-hour news, do journalists have time to fact check information before they get on the air and report a story?
That's a very good question. What we do, yes, you know, it's not all you, it's a team. But what we end up doing is, you know, it's not like you can do a whole deep dive and investigate every kernel of the thing you're on, right? You got to churn and keep going. And there's a lot of sourcing other sources, like the AP reported X, NBC says Y, and we'll just source another source. And there are times when if that original source is wrong, everybody's out saying it and you have to go correct it. But there's a lot more fact checking going on right now than in times past, just because there's this mission to, to fact check the president, frankly. And I'll pause on that for a moment and say, do you notice how I pause? Because I'm too concerned about not sounding partisan and sounding objective, and I don't want to offend anybody by saying that. But the reporting is, the factual thing is, the president often speaks untruths, and so we are obliged to fact check him. Mm-hmm. Puts us in a weird position, because if you're constantly calling out the president, it seems like you're partisan, but you're really like just telling the facts. It's a weird world we're living in.
So we have I think a clarifying question here from Carlos Casas. He says, what do you mean by engage to shift?
Engage
to shift. Do you remember that phrase? I don't remember that, but.
You mean, was I talking about, I asked him to write in with more context. I've already forgotten what I said.
So then we have another question from Sewell Chan of the LA Times.
Hey, I love Sewell.
Yeah. What do you make of the debate between Wesley Lowery, who says that journalism needs to be reestablished on a foundation of moral clarity, and Marty Barron, who stands for more traditional notions of objectivity and detachment?
This is a very good question. This is a heated debate inside the world of journalism. I think that, and for people who aren't familiar, basically, I had said earlier that I think the future is an era of more transparency, where you have more opinionated voices, but they're saying, I'm coming from this point of view, here's my news from this point of view. There's an argument to go even further. There are some who argue you can bring your own personal experience into your news reporting in the newsroom, and let that inform how you tell the story. And then there are these older standards, which are like this idea of objectivity, where you're an invisible eye merely capturing what's happening. I personally lean more toward the transparency. I'm a little uncomfortable with going all the way to my experience as part of the story, but I do think that's more honest, because I believe we all, what you see in the world is shaped by your come from, and we can only report what we're seeing. So why not let the audience know also where we're coming from as we tell it? Mm-hmm. The danger is that you devolve into everybody, like this narcissism of everybody constantly telling their story instead of telling the news. But I think this is an interesting period of evolution, and we might have to go through some of that to get to a more honest place where we reveal a bit more where we're coming from as we report. I would love to know what Sewell thinks, but I can text you later.
So we have another question from Catherine Shirley. With advanced computer technology, we're beginning to receive news based on what we view / like on the internet. For instance, if I search information that is conservative, I begin to get conservative news feeds. Therefore, the information that I consume would just be that which I already subscribe to / believe. Do you think that technology is dangerous? If yes, do you have advice on how to avoid that?
I do think it's dangerous. I think that there are people who understand AI and how these, and the algorithms and what the future of all this looks like in Silicon Valley, who are pushing for changes. And it's kind of a war of, the people who want to do good and right, and the businesses that just want to keep doing business. And I think that it requires, I would say that the solution could be some sort of government regulation, but the problem is that what goes on in Silicon Valley is so lightning speed ahead of what our regulators understand and can catch up with, that there has to be some self-governance. And there's even talk of sort of an external body that gives advice to some of these platforms, and maybe that in combination with cultural pressure from consumers. Like, I do think, I'll say, I hope my mother doesn't mind my revealing this, but I asked her if she could do something on her Facebook page, and she said, I got off Facebook. I'm off Facebook, so are my friends. And I think that as more and more people decide, you sort of vote with your dollars, the consumer pressure could help shift some of these companies, but they'll need some outside force too.
And then we have an anonymous question. Do you think that people are more unwilling today to listen to news and facts that are inconsistent with their political inclinations than has historically been the case? And if so, any ideas why?
Yes, and I think it's because we modeled that. I think that part of the problem with doing all these panel discussions in the news environment, all these debate shows, is that for a generation of people, they came of age or they discovered politics as a pure combat sport. That there is, and I can tell you, when you're casting those discussions, you pick somebody who's going to be two people who are the most oppositional, right? That's how things are now. And so I think we have been modeling politics as pure combat, and we need to show different models where, in Britain, they have, is it Frontline, or they have a show where you have a very aggressive interview with one point of view going deep. And then you can do the other point of view going deep another night. But we could also do environments where you have two people who oppose each other, but you start off by stating the common ground. Mm-hmm. I actually think we need to model that and remind one another that we do have common ground, and you can build coalitions. I think part of it is that our news sources have become so partisan, but we also yell at our viewers. And what if we shifted the way we engage? I mean, I'll just say this. I have learned by being on Instagram and having to constantly talk to people, or getting to constantly talk to people, there's a different way to engage somebody who disagrees with you. And it's not how I was trained. It's much more open. Like, well, tell me why you think that way. What do you think of this? And we need to develop new ways to have the conversations to show people how to talk to people who disagree.
How has the COVID-19 pandemic changed the way the news is reported? How has reporting the news in general changed over the last few years?
Well, I think in the case of COVID, it's a reminder of how valuable the news is. Like, I've been a critic of CNN, but I think it's a national treasure right now. And plenty they do wrong. Yeah, we can have that conversation, but you get like Sanjay Gupta's on there, and Anderson's asking these questions to the public of experts, and across the hours you're actually getting information. And we need that because we're not getting clear information from our federal government right now. So I think during COVID, yes, it can be dark and stressful, and a lot of people need to change their news diet or develop a news diet, which I'm very serious about, so that you limit your consumption. And I have other advice if people are interested in that. But it's not the news's fault that the news is dark and grim. It's your fault if you're not turning it off sometimes. And I think that they're doing a very good job right now of helping to get information out. And it's a little crazy with the news cycle with COVID, and then Floyd, and then the protests, and then COVID. And finally, I saw an Instagram funny that showed a bunch of aliens talking to one another and ready to jump off the spaceship into Earth going, "We're July." You're like, what's next? That's how the news cycle feels.
Yeah, really. Well, what are some of your what is some of your advice for shutting off the news? How do we do that?
Yeah, so for people who find themselves like depressed by the news and by the amount they're consuming, which is a thing, like social science proves that happens. Mm-hmm. Set a time of day, or 2 times, whatever's your thing, 2-3 times a day that you check the news. Decide in advance for how long you'll spend on the news, so you don't get sucked into the black hole of like that tweet, this thread, that blog, a podcast. So time of day, amount of time, sources you trust, and turn off notifications. You don't need notifications. I do. Sewell does. Like, we need to know things as they're happening. Let us be the front line. Turn them off. You don't need to know the minute the thing happens. And then the last thing I'll say is super LA and cheesy. Put down your phone when you're done. Take a moment and close your eyes and like reconnect with yourself. Because one of the things that happens is you find yourself in the story and sped up by it. And you need to like create almost an oxygen gap between it and you to remember, I can't control that. It's happening. I'm informed. This is my life. Wow. 5 steps.
Over the past few years, I've seen a lot of great reporting come out, some not so great reporting. What's your critique of the media today? What are they doing well? Where can they improve?
Well, I think we do a lot of, I think that right now they're doing an amazing job of trying to cover all the things that are happening. And you know, I think the print in general does a more thorough job. It's just the way, in fact, it just is. And, you know, I go to print for the most substantive understanding of the news. I do think the TVs are doing a pretty good job keeping us informed on COVID, et cetera. And of course the Floyd, but there's a lot of noise, you know, and I always feel like my classic example was, we know about all the scandals in the EPA, but how's your drinking water? Like, we need to get out of the building and find out how our policies impacting regular Americans. You know, there's still problems with the water in Flint. Also in Devin Nunes's district are problems with the water. Like, we're not getting enough. How's the country doing? I think, and part of that's because it's so easy to cover the back and forth. It's because Trump is such a focal point and sucks the oxygen because of the drama. And on TV, the panel discussions are just much cheaper to produce than going out into the country. So that's my normal critique. But right now with COVID, you do need that centralized, you know, command and control stuff happening in DC and New York to get a clear message out.
Mm-hmm. What is the best way that people can support journalism and especially local journalism, but just in general?
Pay for it. Pay for it. I can't tell you, this is a job. We need to pay other people to do the job. Just because it's easy to hack it and get it for free doesn't mean, like, if it all went away, you wouldn't be happy. So I can't tell you how many times, you know, on Instagram, I'll post a story and you can swipe up and somebody will tell me, well, it's behind a paywall. And I'll say, if you can't afford it, I completely understand and I can summarize it for you. But if you can, please support their journalism. Mm-hmm. And so for everybody who's on this and probably can afford it, anytime you hear that, like, call for donations, or you've done 10 articles and now it's time to subscribe, what's $10 a month? Do it. Right. Keep the free press alive.
Sure. What are some of your favorite stories that you've covered over the years?
Well, you know what's so weird is I've interviewed presidents, and you know, I've flown on Air Force One, and you know, there's the day that we were all on Air Force One and watching a stupid Jessica Simpson movie. I think it was Dukes of Hazzard. And somebody comes from the front of the cabin up and says, you and you and you and you, and come with me. And we're like, the movie's about to end. I don't want to end they're like, come with me now. And they bring you up to the front and you're sitting with the president. So that's always cool. And I remember at the end of that, my tape recorder broke. So that was, you know, exciting and cool. But really the most compelling stories for me were the ones that were about real people. And I know that's a weird convention that we call people who don't work in politics real. I don't know what it says about those who do, or we all do know what it means. But when I was like in local news and people would just take you into their house, have you sit in their living room and open up about their life story, to me, like, after all these years, that's the stuff that I remember the most and that resonates the most. And it stayed with me as I covered the White House, and I would try to reconnect and think of those families. Like, my obligation is to them, not to the game here, it's to them.
So we have another question from a member, Tim Bruinsma. What are the internal pressure points in a news organization like CNN to influence the bias of a story? How difficult is it to be objective?
So this is one of those areas where the reality is so different from what you perceive. There has truly never been an instance in which someone came to me, a boss, an editor, anyone, and was like, you need to take that out. It'll make X politician look good and we don't want that. Or you need to make it look bad for that. It's not a thing. Mm-hmm. What is a thing is there's enormous pressures to get ratings and perform and make money. And so the pressure from my perspective was always like, what's the way to find the most eye-popping angle on this story to give it the most like jazzy sexiness to get the most attention. And so in TV news, the convention is to default to conflict. There's a belief that only conflict makes you watch, which is crazy because Hollywood is built on empathy. The entire movie industry is about empathy making you watch, I think. But in news, they think only conflict makes you watch. And so how do you amplify the conflict? And so I was constantly fighting this thing of, on the one hand, I'm like, I want to perform. I want to do well, do the thing that makes the story perform and you do well. On the other hand, sometimes it's all dessert and no meat, no broccoli and meat. And so I think the pressure is really to keep the information in the story and not just make it about the rhetoric and the fighting and the pizzazz. But the tension is always like, how can I inform people? How can I make this smart? How can I make them know more while keeping it sexy enough to get attention?
Mm-hmm. We have another question from Colleen Graffy. Could you please repeat the news sources you follow? Axios and The Aggregator. I didn't grab a pencil fast enough. Also, I think the name of the BBC program you were trying to remember is Hard Talk.
Hard Talk. That could be right. I can't even, yeah, okay, I'm going with that. So I read, when I said all the majors, I read the LA Times, the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. I don't read them all, like I look. I am old school and I still go to Drudge every day because when I was coming up in news, that was the aggregator of all aggregators. The political things I referenced were something called Political Wire by Tegan, it's spelled Teagan Goddard. If you Google politicalwire.com, you'll find it. It's the least attractive, no bells or whistles. It's just a feed that pushes you emails when there's political news, and it's awesome. Axios, Politico. If you're looking for Supreme Court news, there's a thing called Lawfare blog. It's all SCOTUS explained. There's something called The Cable, which is what people in DC who are in foreign policy read. I have the AP News and Reuters News apps on my phone. And believe it or not, you can get AP and Reuters on your phone as an app, and they are phenomenal. Business Insider is always good if you don't have time and you just need the 3 top bullets. And I honestly trust all of the major networks, except, I should just say my diet includes ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, and I do check the Fox website, but for other reasons.
We have a question from Paul Fagan. How do you think our social media environment would be different, if at all, if they had a subscription model rather than the current advertising and selling data models?
I would love it. It would be so good because they'd be responsive to the audience. Mm-hmm. I mean, if they're not, I think it was Gloria Steinem who said, if you're not paying for it, you're the product. And we're the product. They're selling us. And that's why we're not getting what we want. We're getting what they make us do or they play to us. So I think it would be great. And I am not one of these people who says it's impossible, because we do see subscription models working. And I think as all of us start to care about this more, we'll be like more attuned to the importance of that. And so I think when your customers are the ones paying, you're going to provide for the customers what they need and want, and they'll be better. Mm-hmm. I just think we need new entities to do it, because I don't see Facebook doing that. But whatever.
We have a question from Gil Sanborn. What do you think a national strategy on social media disinformation would look like?
This is really interesting and different from what I thought it was, because I always thought, well, if you just start refuting the claims, people will, start to get it. And the truth is, sometimes in even stating back the claims, it reifies it. Hmm. People then think it's a legitimate argument. Oh, well, maybe there are 2 sides to this. And I think what it actually requires is leaders who are willing to be truthful and tell the truth. And I think that we need to understand persuasion science so that we figure out how to help people know what's true and not. I mean, the real truth is we need to teach critical thinking and civics in school. Like, that's what it comes down to. So if we can't do it in school, I'm constantly pitching, like, everybody I know in Hollywood, you need to start a show about civics where you just explain, like, Schoolhouse Rock again, but for, like, grown-ups, because grown-ups even don't get it.
We have a question from Dave McMurtry. When will publishers enable piecemeal articles? I already subscribe to the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, which is more content than I have the time to possibly consume, and is the reason I'm not willing to subscribe to 20 other sites just to read one article. When will they understand that we want an Apple Music Store experience and pay 99 cents per long-form article?
Well, I think Apple has started trying that, where you can subscribe to them and they'll give you a bevy of articles. I think we're not there yet because everybody runs their own newsroom and they need to figure out how to make ends meet for themselves. And it's not enough money if you're paying a nickel or a dime, or a nickel or a penny for every, article. Probably it'll be like less than that. It just, you can't produce content for that little. So I think, when you're more independent, when there are more independent journalists, I happen to think that the future will be that we will follow the journalists we like rather than the institution. So there'll be a reporter at the New York Times that you love and you will follow that person. And maybe there's a disaggregated way that you can find payment for that. But how the models work right now, it's not sustainable. And one solution is for, some tax money to go to our national media organizations. I know that that's controversial in this country, but most Western democracies do that.
We have an anonymous question. Do you think local TV news is getting better, and do you think it is more trusted than cable news?
I think some local news is good. Like what Spectrum does here, I think is great. And, there's local shows on PBS that I think are great. The problem with local news is they pay so much for the franchise, and then you have to do the car chases and the shootings in order to get the eyeballs, and so that's hard on TV. In print, 1,000%. I should say, I think one of the reasons we've lost trust in the press, or we're losing, is the loss of the local paper. Because I mentioned this earlier, but it used to be the case that while there are far-flung reporters out there in Washington or overseas, the person who brought you your news was a publisher and an editor-in-chief that you either could see getting a coffee in your town or read about or see pictures of. You knew people who you saw them around you. And that local connection builds trust and credibility. And I don't think it's a coincidence that when so many of these local papers have gone away is the moment at which our mistrust of the news has accelerated. Mm-hmm. And so we do need to find ways to connect this to the local. And it's also the only way really to have a sense of how our country's doing. Like, the local reporters are the ones who source what's going on the ground. And so we really need to find a way to support that.
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing that everywhere. We have a question from Jennifer Stanley. Do you use PBS as a source, and what do you think of their effort to be nonpartisan?
I've known I happen to know the people who are working on PBS NewsHour really well. And so I just love them. And they're big-hearted, smart, serious women who really run that operation. So I love them. They're part of they're like the best example of how news has worked. I also think at the same time, we're just because of the pressures we've been talking about, we are moving to a more point of view reality. And my perspective is you can't fight Napster forever. You know what I mean? Like, when the music industry started changing, they tried to shut down Napster and thought the problem would go away. It just comes back in another form. So I revere PBS and the NewsHour, and I'm glad it's here, and it should always be there. That doesn't mean these other forms of journalism aren't going to be very powerful in the future, and we need to come to terms with that and accept that reality and make it work.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Tatiana Bassanez. I guess it was a comment on something you said earlier. She says, persuasion science is social psychology. What's needed to train more journalists in this?
Oh, well, we need to just study it and take classes and have it available. And I mean, as soon as I said that, people will say, oh, you're trying to brainwash people. It's just about understanding how to communicate in ways that people will hear. I referenced this earlier, like how do you shift how we do dialogue so that you can find common ground across disagreements? And I just think it's something that we should learn. It's about learning how we hear, learn, and communicate. And it should be taught, maybe it should be taught in school, maybe it's something journalists can do as a, a class. It dovetails with my whole perspective on news, which is that we've left out certain audiences because of the way we tell it. There are certain women who can't take all the screaming and all the conflict and all the outrage, so they just don't pick up the paper. Let's find a new tone in which to communicate and a new focal point for each story to engage the audience differently.
So we have another question here. Have you seen or been affected by foreign disinformation?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, when I was chief White House correspondent at CNN, people were constantly calling me and telling me things, and I'm like, okay, whatever, I'm not doing that. I don't, everything feels like disinformation. One of the most interesting things that this just brought to mind, it's different. I taught a course at the University of Chicago Institute of Politics. And I was talking, it was a course about the media and how the media works. And there was a international student there from China who would always come to office hours. And his question always was, where in the news organization does the censor sit? Mm-mm. And I would always explain to him, no, we don't have that. I mean, sometimes, I'm not saying we're perfect, we'll self-censor for whatever, but we don't have it. And he'd come back the next week and he'd be like, so do the censors work for the advertisers? And that's how they censor? You're like, no, it doesn't work that way. And literally for a semester, he came every office hour trying to figure out how the censor worked.
Wow.
So that's like state disinformation. I never really had, I'm trying to think, I mean, I dealt with spin all day, every day from the US. So I got a pretty, sophisticated set of antenna.
Mm-hmm. Another anonymous question here. How does one report about structural injustices objectively?
But this is one of the things that I just question, what does objectively mean? I think that if you're, as we've seen, if you're a Black reporter, your vision of what structural injustice is, racial structural injustice, is just deeper and bigger and more historic. Like you have a better historical sense than a white reporter because you've been so attuned to it for so long. And they've been telling us this, like Black reporters are talking about it now, how they haven't been able to speak they've seen and been true. So even if they're giving you a straight ahead news story, what I'm trying to say is even in their straight ahead news story, that seems like they have no first person, no, my experience was, what they see as they talking, what they hear, what they understand is going to be more rich than what I would, just because of the fact that they've been attuned to it in a different way for longer. So I think that, structural injustices have to be reported. We have to talk about it. Like not even everybody agrees that there are structural injustices. So even having the conversation opens, up more opportunities. And we have to be more willing to accept that, people who have a lived experience can enlighten us by bringing some of that into the stories.
Do you think we should be concerned about sliding further down this path of, the way reporters have been treated lately at these big protests by law enforcement? The Black reporter who was arrested live on air on CNN, for example, reporters saying I'm pressed, they're lying on their bellies on the floor and getting maced in the face for no reason. It seems to have taken a dark turn between law enforcement and journalists lately.
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's chilling. I mean, that is the line between, freedom and fascism, right? Like that's vital. And I think I don't think this is 100% like something turned on in this moment. I covered the Tea Party movement. I covered Palin rallies. I had the experience of, people. I was never physically attacked, but there was up in your face hatred, threatening behavior. There was, you remember when they used to say, exercise your Second Amendment rights. I want to exercise, and right there's the free press. Do you want to exercise your Second Amendment rights on them? Those sorts of things predate this moment. And so I think we've had a tolerant attitude about it and kind of didn't know how to engage it. And the thing is, now we can't deny that this is a problem. I have friends in the press who are scared to go to certain places because they know that there's just this fear that at some point someone's going to get really hurt. And they're now accompanied by security a lot of places, and that's not the America I know.
We have another question here. Journalism has become such a dangerous profession in places like the Philippines, where the government is currently trying to curtail press freedom with the Maria Ressa cyber libel case, the ABC-CBN shutdown, and the controversial anti-terror bill. How would you encourage journalists in these risky countries to continue their mission to deliver the truth?
I mean, I don't think they need encouragement. People do this because it's a mission and a calling, and the crackdown in some ways makes them need to do it more. I do hope that America regains its sort of standing in the world so that we have the moral force and the economic power and other power to try to encourage other countries, gently and not so gently, to treat the press as a free press, or at least not come after them. But we don't really have the standing to do that right now. So I think that what we're seeing is that that's a far end problem, and it's all on a continuum. Maybe by looking at what's going on there, we have a better understanding here of how dangerous it is to slide down that slope. But I, have nothing but reverence for what she's done and they're doing. And I do think that journalists will continue to risk their lives to get the story out because you're born needing to do that.
Mm-hmm. You suggested earlier social media companies should be regulated in the same way that traditional media is. For folks outside of the world of media, what does that mean? How are media outfits regulated?
So one of media outlets, for example, if you're, let's just make up an outfit, ATN News, that was the news network in my book. They cannot put an ad on television that's a lie. They can't say this bottle of bleach will, make you grow 3 inches and, whatever, revitalize your sex life. You can't do that. It's a lie. On Facebook, you literally can do that. And in fact, during the campaign, Elizabeth Warren made an ad that was a fake lie ad, bought time on Facebook to say, I did this, I said a lie and I'm buying time on Facebook and they're letting me do this, and it all was no problem. And their position is, we're a neutral platform, we're not a media source. So their position is they take no responsibility for what people post or even information from which they're making money. So political ads off of which they're making money, they don't have to check it for accuracy. Whereas CNN, NBC, ABC, they all do. So that is like baseline what should change. That is the difference between being a media brand where I'm responsible for what's put through my pipes and a neutral platform where I'm just the pipes, I can't help what gets out through them. At the most basic level, that can't go on.
How do you think we can effectively combat the spread of disinformation by state actors? What role does traditional media have, social media? To what extent is the government collaborating with media to combat these fake narratives?
I mean, one of the things they've learned is that you don't even rebroadcast them, right? Like, there used to be this thing that like showing it and telling you it's a lie is the best way to do it. And unless it's like so dominant you need to talk about it, don't put it out there. There was just a conspiracy theory video that got so much attention and so many people were asking me about it. I actually did a debunking. It was necessary, but sometimes it's just like, don't even get into it. I think everyone's so overwhelmed. It's very hard. Like, what they're doing is you state the facts and you state that these are the facts and that's just the fact. right? And so it's repetition of the actual information.
Right.
There are some things that are murky, like, will this tax cut lead to growth? Like, that can be a debate, but you know, just coughing in someone's face without a mask spread COVID is yes, that's a fact. We need to not do that. And so you just have to own it. So I think some of what we've seen is organizations learning how you do this well. And so they're doing it. In terms of stopping the spread of disinformation, that's talk to Facebook, talk to Twitter, talk to TikTok and those sources. 4chan. I mean, hello.
Right. Just briefly before we wrap up here, you know, people are often interested about the behind the scenes of what it's like to be a White House correspondent. What are the politics, logistics of the briefing room? What's it like to fly and report on Air Force One? Is it hard to hold power accountable when it's right there in front of you?
So the thing about covering the White House is it gets very exhausting, but there are some things that never get old. So the press briefing room is teeny tiny, and you live and work in a booth that's the size of a small shower. And there are often people, like you'll have a Formica desk with 3 people sitting on one side and 3 people on the other side, and you're crammed into this tiny shower and there's zero privacy. And it's dank and you're in a basement and it doesn't smell great. And to get to food, you have to pass through security and cross many blocks. And it's like a physically challenging situation. On the other hand, when the president comes and goes, we always go out to watch it. And every single time Marine One, that big helicopter, flies in, you're standing on the White House lawn and it flies past the Washington Monument and with the thumping wings lands in front of you and it says United States of America, it's a thrill. And every time you go to Andrews Air Force Base and you walk out on the tarmac and you see Air Force One in front of you, it's a thrill. And those are the things that help when you keep the job exciting. It's not like it's the perk, it's a reminder of why you're doing this. Like, it's a larger calling. And you're not doing it to service your boss or DC, you're doing it because this is part of what America is. And those are the moments you get that reminder. That said, Air Force One itself has the worst food. And like the chairs are so uncomfortable and all of it is not what you think. But it doesn't really matter because that's not why you're there.
Well, Jessica, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for your interest. And please follow me on Instagram at Jessica Yellin.
And where's the best place for people to get your book?
And you can buy it, well, it's right behind me here, but you can buy it on Amazon. It's called Savage News. It's a very fun beach read, perfect for COVID, summer 2020.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. And thank you again to all our members and guests for joining the call. We will continue to have even more great programming over the coming weeks. I encourage you to join us on the week of July 20th for our Beyond the Horizon Virtual Summit, which will convene experts such as former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin, and a lot more. You can learn more about all of our upcoming programs on our website, pacificcouncil.org. Have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.